This is a sub-conference, and of course, what we try to do in these conversations is for it to be very engaging. So at any time during the conversation, we'd like to remind you that you are more than welcome to engage with our speakers who will be giving presentations, and of course, asking them any questions. Just raise your hand, a roving mic will make its way to you, and there are opportunities for you to raise your thoughts, difference of opinion, and even some questions and other areas that you'd like us to unpack. Our first speaker for this particular session, bearing in mind that we are under slight pressure for time, however, we will try to wrap up by 12:10, 10 minutes after 12, is Shomik Lal, who is from the World Bank Global Lead for Territorial and Spatial Development. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone, and I'm really glad to start this conversation. I urge you to take seats up front. I promise you I'm not contagious, so you can come up front. I work for the World Bank, and much of the work you see about the World Bank is of our investment portfolio. But we also have a very active knowledge program, and the work I'm going to talk to you today over the next 20 minutes or so is of a flagship report we've been doing over the past 4 years on the spatial development of African cities. And the main idea here is how do we get cities in Africa to be more productive and more competitive and increase economic prosperity throughout the region. I want to start off with a little vignette of a conversation I had when I was in Bamako in Mali earlier this year. Oops. And I met this very inspirational gentleman, Abdullah Dioko, who is an architect and a planner. And he's working in some of the poorest communities, the Téléphone Sans Fil neighborhoods in Bamako, and trying to see what is it in terms of action that government and the private sector can do to enhance living conditions in that place. And if you've been to West Africa, you probably have seen scenes like this, incredibly colorful markets, vibrant people. But next to that is also communities where schools are provided by community organizations. But the negative side is that much of these places lack capital investment. This is a neighborhood, Téléphone Sans Fil, which is right next to a Shell storage dump. You've got dirty water running through. Kids are getting sick with the contaminated water. And Abdullah keeps saying, what is it that the development community, the private sector can do to redevelop these places to make them livable and make them productive? And these pictures are not only what you see in Mali. You go to Kenya, you go to Mozambique, you go to Zambia. There are pictures like this all around. But this is not only a picture of Bamako, because today, when you look at Africa's urban population, it's about 470 million, plus minus a few. But if you fast forward to about 2025, the population increases to about 659 million. That's like adding the whole country of Nigeria to Africa's urban population in 15 years or less. And if I take these numbers up to 2040, the numbers reach 1 billion people in Africa's towns and cities. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, this sort of pace of urban growth has never been seen in the world's history ever. We are experiencing perhaps the most dramatic urban transformation this world has ever seen. And yet, when we ask the question, what is it that this urban transformation can get us? Can it get us prosperity and jobs like you saw in East Asia? I don't know if any of you know that Korea, back in 1960, was the poorest country in the world. It was also about 10% urbanized. Today, Korea is one of the richest countries in the world. It's about 90% urbanized. That's been the story of countries who could really use urbanization, really harness cities to build the right kinds of structures, to get the right kinds of jobs, and take their countries on the path to prosperity. Yet when you look across in Africa, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, even here in South Africa, the link between a city's growth and the economy's growth has been severed. And that's the question we at the World Bank were very interested to find out. What is it that's making this link break up? And city leaders around the world ask us, what is it we need to do to get cities on back as pathways to prosperity? So this has been the question that we've been dealing with or trying to understand over the past few years, with the main idea that Africa's cities are growing in numbers of people, but not in economic activity. And what we find, part of the reason that we see is that Africa's cities are incredibly costly for, let me roll this back 1 second, costly for people, and they're costly for firms. African countries are among the poorest in the world in terms of per capita income, this country excluded. But yet, the cost of living in the African cities are about 30% higher than countries at similar levels of income. This is making it really difficult for people to be kind of getting through with their daily lives. And do you know what's really the costliest? It's housing. Housing is 55% costlier in Africa cities than in similar income levels around the world. This is a major issue and something that we looked at very carefully through data from household surveys, from censuses, to produce these numbers. But there's a grimmer story here. When much of Europe started building housing investments, they used a lot of foreign savings. That means their firms were competitive, they were trading, they could get foreign investment, and on the back of it, they built up the property markets. But in Africa, much of housing all relies on domestic savings. And here it becomes even problematic. I can't seem to get the slide to go forward. Okay. Is that given that African cities are so expensive, firms in internationally traded sectors have to pay much higher wages to compensate for these high costs in urban areas. As a result, what African cities are doing, they're producing only goods and services that are traded locally. They're made in the city and sold in the city. They're not producing goods and services that are sold to the rest of the world. No matter whether you're in Joburg, you're in Nairobi, you're in Lagos, or Accra, no matter how big your city is, unless you have an economic engine that trades with the rest of the world, your market is really limited. This means more people come to the city, you trade locally, and your wages go down, your earnings go down. This is the big story in Africa, that we have cities that are growing in numbers, but we all closed our doors to the world. We're only trading, consuming, selling locally. This needs to change. So, given these pictures of African cities and the numbers that African cities are producing and selling locally, I thought we could all just put up a sign that's saying, we're just closed for business. To the rest of the world, why should the other foreign companies come invest in African cities? How can African producers trade with the rest of the world? We need to figure out the root of these problems. So that's kind of what we have been working with to try to understand better. But every time we talk to African policymakers, at the city level, at the national level, to ministers of finance, there's one answer that's very popular. It's the natural resource curse. And here the idea is that Africa's economies over the last 2 decades have been growing on the back of commodities. And this commodity boom has made Africa's manufacturing or Africa's industries very uncompetitive. Because what it's doing is that it's raising factor prices in other industries. And what it means is that Africa's cities, compared to the rest of the world, have been locked out of producing tradable goods and services. It also messes up with exchange rates, makes it very difficult for our firms and our cities to compete outside. But we are today in an area or a period where commodity prices are lower than they were perhaps some time ago? Can we take this as an opportunity to get Africa's cities back as drivers of productivity? So we started asking a question that if I was working at the city level, if I was in the private sector, I was in local government, what could I do? And here the answer we wanted to explore, can we think about how cities are built, how cities are laid out? And the picture that really struck me was when I looked at maps or pictures of jobs in cities like London, in New York, in Hong Kong. I could tell you another dozen cities like this. There are two things that really stand out. One is there's huge investments in structures where jobs are created: commercial, industrial, residential. Everything, all investments are clustered, so you can have peaks of employment like you see about 150,000 jobs per square kilometer in downtown London. Another 150,000 jobs per square kilometer in downtown New York. And that's what makes cities really productive. And linking to these investments in structures are really high-speed transport investments that connect people, businesses, connect homes, and opportunities. That's the physical form you see in many global cities. So how do African cities compare? And when we started this work, we didn't really know whether African cities had these peak densities. Maybe here in Sandton, you have some of it. But if you were to go around in Nairobi, in Addis, if you go to in Kampala, I don't see these things. We really didn't know. So we invested a lot in putting together data over 20 years, data from satellites that are so powerful that can look at the Earth at 0.5 meter in scale. And we use machine learning algorithms to translate these pictures taken from space into investments in structures. And what we wanted to see was how do African cities compare to global cities which are economically dense and connected. As a result, they're livable and productive. So what we find is that one of the biggest constraints that we see in African cities is lack of capital investments. And here is a chart I want you to look at. And this is technology is sort of faster than I can control. That when East Asia urbanized, incomes per capita were about $3,000 when East Asia reached about 50% urbanization. And that happened about 20 years ago. When Latin America urbanized, got to about 40% urban, they had about $1,800 per capita in terms of incomes. Africa today is 40% urban at about $1,000 per capita. Capital investments as a result in Africa as a share of GDP have not gone beyond 20% at a time when urbanization has been the fastest. In contrast, when you think about China or Vietnam, when China urbanized, capital investment went from 20% of GDP to about 56% of GDP, much of it in structures, in commercial structures, and in infrastructure. We have to kind of see how do we get more capital at this level of income into Africa cities. But a bigger question, for whatever capital that does exist, how do we use it better? And an example here is what African countries spend on housing. And if you look at middle-income countries on average, and we looked at the data from national accounts for many years, most middle-income countries spend about 7% of GDP on housing. African countries that are middle income spend about 5%. In low-income Africa, it goes down to 4%. So clearly, in terms of investment and capital, Africa's cities or African urbanization is lacking in terms of structures. But it's not only investments in physical structure. What we also saw is economic structures. And many of you in the real estate industry, maybe thinking about real estate commercial capital. And when I look at a city like Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, the downtown of the city is about built up 25% industrial and commercial. But if I were to look at Nairobi, it's about 6%. If I were to look at Addis, it's 1%. And if I were to look at Kigali, that's less than 1%. So even here, we have not only investments in housing that are lacking behind, investments in commercial structures and industrial structures are lacking behind. But if I were to think that it's just a lack of investment that's the biggest problem in Africa's cities, I would probably be kidding myself. The reason is we can always find new sources of finance. We can always tap markets to create the structures needed. But what's really worrying is how Africa's cities are developing as tiny little fragments that are disconnected with each other. And what I mean is that if you think about urban development, there are three ways in which cities can expand. One is they can expand right on the periphery of existing urban built-up area, and that's kind of normal. The other way cities can develop is having huge infill, which is slow to do. But the third way in which cities are expanding is through disconnected fragments that have nothing to do with existing built-up form. And what we see in Africa and in South Africa here is that's the dominant nature of urban expansion. What it means is that if I was trying to provide infrastructure, or you as a real estate developer were trying to do a subdivision at scale, you just can't do it. Because you need economies of scale to put in the bulk in order to subdivide a place and to get infrastructure down that actually has lower unit cost. Please go ahead. I think you have raised a really important question. I think satellite towns are great ideas, if needed. But what you see in Nairobi is patches of urban development. They're not the satellite towns. But if you were to go from Nairobi, the city downtown outwards, you see all this unbuilt area. That's what really makes it difficult to provide infrastructure. Think about if I was to provide a BRT in Nairobi. How do I get the trip density or the density of demand, right? Because the fragmented nature just makes it impossible. So I don't think there's anything wrong in developing these satellite towns. They've got scale. But what's really constraining Africa is that land is owned by so many different landowners, some customary, some with the city government, some we just don't know. Just to develop land at scale, I think, is a big issue, right? So I think that's kind of the point that we really think is important. So this is really the point that about 70% of Africa's urban expansion is happening at these leapfrog patches. And what this means that if I were to provide infrastructure, I was to think about a BRT, a bus system, all that requires density of demand, I just can't do it. And what it means that the African cities, if you're not careful, are going to leapfrog to a very car-dependent, automobile-locked kind of societies and economies. And these are some numbers that I was very struck by, that if I were to think about the unit cost of developing commuter rail, metro rail, BRTs, like here in this country, the cost is very high, but if we have density of demand that's high enough, they can become the most affordable, sustainable ways of urban mobility. But by not getting the land use right, by not getting the densities right, are we locking ourselves out of sustainable urban development solutions? I think that's a question we need to think about. So what we also find is that this disconnected urban form really makes Africa's cities more expensive. Our econometric work shows that this kind of urban structures add between 11 to 20% to African urban costs. So at the end of the day, what I want to kind of put in front of you is that we need to have a different model for Africa's urban development. One that moves away from cities looking inwards, producing and consuming locally, to one that opened their doors to the world. And every time I've given this talk, people ask me, so there must be about 100 things we need to do. And yes, there could be 100 things we could do, but if I were to list down the 100, none of it will be important. So I'm going to tell you two things. The first thing is probably the most difficult thing, is we need to have more credible institutions to manage the use of land, the transfer of land, and the development of land. I think if I were to pick one thing that we need to do different, and I think it relates to this session because the next speaker is going to talk about master plans, is we need to figure out how to get property rights assigned, how to make land use compatible with what the market wants. This is a fundamental issue. And here, our study, we looked at the different land rights in Africa's cities. In Durban, for example, I believe that there's a huge issue in how the city of Durban can manage its expansion, because much of the land is in customary use, and there is tension in how that land can be used for different purposes. Getting land rights is very important. You as developers, if you were to develop a piece of land, but the land use could be changed at any moment and make your land unworthy, there's no way you're going to put the money in. And the problem is we need to have credible institutions that can hold, and judicial systems that are accountable. So you can take your issue and go to the courts, and we can have a real discussion and a real verdict on the use of land. I've seen in many places, developers go in, they think they can build 4 stories, and suddenly the land becomes agriculture, right? And once this pattern happens often enough, there's no developer who wants to go put their money in. So this is a big issue we need to think and work through. And the biggest example, I would like to give you one example, and I think you know it probably very well, is a group in Nairobi who are called the Nubians. I don't know if any of you have heard of them. And the Nubians used to fight for the British crown in the wars. And as a reward, they were allowed to settle on a piece of land that today is called Kibera. But what happened was that they got possessory land rights, but not real tradable property rights. So our research shows that because they did not get these tradable property rights, the development costs in Nairobi are over $1 billion. Because the structures, given the economic conditions in Nairobi, you would expect to see high-rise economic structures in those places, but you don't. This is almost equal to 70% of Kenya's per capita GDP. This is a huge loss, both to the economy, to people, to the market. The second issue is about development regulations. When I started working on Dar es Salaam, I was very surprised that lot sizes, I don't know if any of you worked with lot sizes, this bothers you or not. It's the minimum piece of land that can be purchased to make it comply with master plans. And in Nairobi, in Dar es Salaam, it was 375 square meters. The problem is that there is hardly anyone in Dar es Salaam who can afford to buy a property that has 375 square meters. So what you see, the lines in blue, is that most of the buildings in Dar es Salaam have violated the master plan or the building code. So now if I, as a developer, want to go and redevelop that piece of land, I don't get access to mortgage finance. I don't get access to any kind of support of supporting infrastructure. And suddenly, the whole city has been locked into informality because development regulations are incompatible with levels of development in the country. And this is another issue that you see across Africa. I believe in Dar es Salaam, the planners want to take it up to 600 square meters. This is a problem. On the other hand, I was taking my children out to the city of Philadelphia in the US, which used to be the first capital of the country. And there, the picture you see on the bottom right is what the old settlers' house used to look like, 28 square meters. And so, it's not that these things are alien or these things can't be done. We just need to make sure the market and the government can kind of work together to think about development-friendly regulations. So the first was about getting the land issues right. The second issue I would like to highlight is to coordinate the development of infrastructure with the development of land. Too often, we have infrastructure policies that are completely uncoordinated with land use policies. Transport plans are uncoordinated with land use plans. And here comes kind of the issues about how do we do it. And too often, we focus on solutions like the shiny highways or the big bus systems, but not about neighborhood infrastructure. And you, in the developer industry, I think have a big role to play about lowering down the cost of producing development. So an example here is something the World Bank did in the 1960s in Dar es Salaam. We used to do a lot of these projects called sites and services. I don't know if anyone has heard of these projects, but they used to be very basic, standard, low standard projects saying, we don't know where development's going to happen, but we're going to subdivide a place, and we're going to provide basic bulk. And if the market takes off, well, people are going to put in their own investment. And this idea takes a long time to bear fruit. It takes 15 years, 20 years to bear fruit. And people get really restless because they want to see results right now. So at the World Bank, this became out of favor, and now we never did it, but part of our team went back and reassessed these old projects. What we saw was that the urban structure in those sites and services project on the top side of the picture, they really followed the basic grid that was laid out 30 years ago. On the bottom is an upgraded settlement. That means random settlements and people are just putting their own money and the structures were much less regulated. But what's more interesting, that in terms of property values, the land values in these settlements that were planned ahead, or the sites and services, were much higher because people found the basic structure to be useful, and as they got better off, they put incremental investments in. And this was quite different from kind of, not having, and they did it because they had access to basic services and infrastructure. So if there were two things I would like you to think about as we think about planning in Africa cities, the first is getting land markets to work and getting land use to be compatible with development levels in Africa. The second is to really align infrastructure development with land use development. And the reason I focus on all of these two issues is that they have long-lived consequences. Once a parcel of land is zoned, you put in the basic infrastructure, that's going to live with you for 150 years or so. All the other stuff we can change, we can kind of retrofit, but once a place is kind of planned out, that's a long-lived mistake, and we're going to pay for it for a long, long time. So there may be other things we should do, and I think we have a lot of things to do, but getting the fundamentals right is really important, especially for improving living conditions of people, lowering the cost of consumption, and as a result, allowing African cities to be more productive and competitive in global markets. Thank you. The floor is open for questions. Yeah. Please.
Thanks. My name is Cameron Rush. I'm a managing director for a consultancy company in Nairobi, and we focus on a lot of these master plan cities. And I think you're right, there's a big disconnect between local authorities and developers, and making sure that for the future, the consequences that we are putting forward are going to excuse me, going to live with us for a long time. What we're seeing is that excuse me. What we're seeing is that the understanding of the regulators is not there. How do we work together to improve that going forward? Sorry, yeah.
I think that's a really good point, is more transparency and information in the rules of the game that's set by government. And I was really surprised when I was talking to officials in Nairobi. There's a master plan around, but it's not really been endorsed, right? So, and so the market doesn't know what the government's going to do. I think part of the whole urban development structure is to get markets to see signals that are credible. And that's the kind of work we're trying to kind of work with, but we would really like the private sector to be more involved in making a case for these, right? Because it's resources that are locked and not being used for development, not being used for market use, right? So that's a big issue. Absolutely.
Hi, I'm a developer in Nairobi, Karibu Homes. We do large-scale affordable housing projects. And I agree with you, one of the big problems, even for attracting investment, is the fact that land tenure is so sensitive. So an international investor is automatically going to be putting a bar down and saying, well, it's too risky to buy the land. That's one thing. But my question is, like, we can't stop developing because the demand is there. So in between the regulatory guys and the policies falling in place and the infrastructure coming, we as developers have to basically take matters into our own hands and provide all of it ourselves. And, you know, ideas like when I was building in the UK, something called Section 106, where the developer has to contribute a certain amount to something within the community that they're building in. So like it could be a playground or the road. And many developers that I know would be happy to do that in Nairobi because it enhances the value faster. Would these sort of short-term breaks, do they actually have an impact? Should we bother, or do we just continue taking matters into our own hands and doing our master plans and sort of ignoring what happens outside our walls?
Any other questions? Because this is really important. Please, yeah, absolutely.
I'm Zama from Delta Property Fund. I just have a quick question. In terms of trends, have you noticed that more people are starting to plan their cities with more, let's say, renewable energy compartments? So let's say like solar panels, for instance, or wind turbines. Are more developers starting to include that into their master plans? Or are we still at a point whereby that's not something we're looking at? Because obviously everyone's chasing return on investments and things like that. But are you noticing that trend, like a growing trend towards going greener, making cities greener and just having that provision? Thanks.
Okay, let me start with your question. I think this is a really good question about building technologies that allow for sustainability. One city that I was very struck with was the city of Kigali. And Kigali has really been making, so I don't know about broad trends, I know of certain vignettes and examples. And Kigali's been really concerned about keeping green urban development as one of the focus of what they're doing. And the person in charge of the city authority is very concerned about the small-scale urban expansion that's going on. So I think it's in small pockets, but I don't see a broad trend overall. Part of it is also to do with construction codes and zoning codes and building standards. And unless those things change, it'll be very difficult to get sustainable building practices across. So that's an issue to think about. I think on the question of Nairobi, it's from a developer's perspective, it makes total sense to subdivide land and to provide bulk services within your community. But if you think about from the city's perspective, it becomes problematic. Because often the infrastructure demand that you create can't be served by the means that the city is providing. In a perfect world, you would want great coordination between that. But the one model that seems to work very decently is the American model of the subdivisions, where developer produces such large land lots and divides them and provides bulk infrastructure that it's basically absorbing a lot of capital costs of the broad infrastructure system. I don't know enough about how Nairobi is doing it, but these are some things we should definitely discuss and keep talking about. I guess there's a big group of people who want to go to the next session. So thank you very much for your, okay, why don't you ask your last question? We can have the answers later, right? So.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Taslim Gum. I'm from Senegal. My question is about the model. We're talking about African cities. Aren't we trying to replicate models that are not necessarily suitable for our way of living? This whole high-density urban centers, monocentric or polycentric, doesn't matter. Is this really the best for Africa?
Great question. I'm going to take 1 minute as I'm being kicked out. Is that in Dakar, you guys are building a new airport city. It's the same model. The point is density really works, right? It drives down the cost of providing infrastructure. It makes it possible to provide transport at scale. And I think in Dakar and West Africa, and particularly, policymakers have embraced density. The airport city is one example. All they need is private investments to make it work. But we can, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.